November 20th, 1943. Dawn broke over the Pacific like a dull, rust-colored blade. The sea was restless, carrying thousands of young U.S. Marines toward a speck of land barely 2 miles long. The island of Betio, part of the Tarawa atoll, lay ahead, low, flat, and bristling with fortifications that looked like jagged teeth against the rising sun. The air trembled with the distant echo of naval guns. Battleships had hammered the island for hours, sending pillars of smoke curling into the sky. Many Marines aboard the landing craft believed few defenders could have survived such a bombardment. Salt spray hit their faces. Engines roared. The closer they came, the darker the shoreline seemed, a maze of barbed wire, pillboxes, trenches, and machine gun nests waiting with eerie stillness. Some clutched rosaries. Others checked their rifles repeatedly, hands shaking not from cold, but from the unknown. And beyond that thin strip of sand, an enemy waited, one that had openly mocked the very men now approaching. Because in Tokyo, in mess halls and officers' clubs, confidence had grown into arrogance. Japanese officers laughed at the idea that American Marines could ever take a fortified island. Yet within the next 3 days, that certainty would bleed into silence, a silence born on the shores of Tarawa. In the early years of the Pacific War, the balance of power in the vast ocean had shifted like a tide few could predict. The Japanese Empire, after its stunning offensive across Asia and the Pacific in 1941-42, had entrenched itself behind a defensive ring of island fortresses stretching from the central Pacific to Southeast Asia. Each outpost was designed to slow, bleed, or repel any American attempt to advance westward. By late 1942, the United States had tasted its first major land victory in the Pacific at Guadalcanal. The 6-month struggle revealed 2 truths. The U.S. Marines were far more resilient than Japan had expected, and Japan would not relinquish territory easily. Still, inside Japanese military circles, many officers dismissed Guadalcanal as an anomaly, a close-run fight won only through American naval and industrial advantage, not combat skill. To them, the U.S. Marine Corps remained a small, relatively inexperienced force untested in storming heavily fortified positions. The Imperial Japanese Navy viewed its own special naval landing forces as the superior counterpart, battle-hardened, steeped in Bushido, and trained with a belief in spiritual and moral strength surpassing Western material power. Many Japanese commanders believed American troops lacked endurance, discipline, and the will to die for their objective. This perception did not emerge from thin air. For decades, pre-war Japanese military doctrine taught that Western soldiers, especially Americans, were softened by comfort and weak of spirit. Japan's victories over European colonial forces in Hong Kong, the Philippines, and Malaya appeared to validate this belief. Propaganda reinforced the narrative. The Allies were rich, mechanized, and complacent. Japan's warriors were spiritually superior. The U.S. Marine Corps, meanwhile, was still evolving. Before the war, it had been a relatively small, expeditionary force known mostly for interventions in the Caribbean and Central America, the so-called Banana Wars. Its reputation as an elite amphibious force was respected by military planners, but not widely acknowledged on the global stage. Few outside America grasped how intensely the Marines had studied and prepared for amphibious warfare during the interwar years. By 1943, the Pacific had become a grinding contest of attrition. Japan's perimeter was vast but thinly stretched. The U.S. faced a strategic fork: approach Japan from the south through the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, or strike through the central Pacific, island by island, toward the Marshall, Mariana, and Caroline chains. The latter path would require amphibious assaults against some of the most heavily defended islands in the world. Japanese leaders believed such an attempt would be suicidal. Among those strongpoints sat Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands, small, remote, but strategically placed like a gate across the Central Pacific. It became part of Japan's plan to make America pay dearly for every mile of advance. If the U.S. Marines truly lacked the ability to seize fortified beaches, Tarawa would expose it. Throughout 1942 and 1943, Japanese officers spoke with confidence. Some predicted that even 100,000 Americans could not take a single well-defended island from a few thousand determined Japanese defenders. On paper and in doctrine, their logic seemed sound. Fortifications, overlapping fields of fire, pre-sighted artillery, and the conviction that death was preferable to defeat. Yet beneath their confidence lay a growing tension. Japan's industry was strained. Its defensive network depended on isolated islands holding out long enough for reinforcements. Reinforcements Japan increasingly struggled to send. Still, few in Tokyo believed the Marines could break through the first line of defenses. The Japanese officer corps, rooted in tradition and pride, underestimated the adaptability and will of their opponent. As 1943 progressed, the United States prepared to challenge that belief. Plans formed to strike the Gilbert Islands, not only to secure airfields and a forward base, but to test whether American amphibious doctrine could succeed against a modern fortress defended by an enemy sworn to fight to the last breath. The next stage of the war would not be fought across jungles, but across coral reefs and beaches stained by incoming tides. The coming battle would reveal whether the Marines could overcome the very challenge Japan insisted they were too weak to face. And on a small, heavily fortified island named Betio, both sides were about to discover what the other was truly capable of. By mid-1943, the United States had gathered enough momentum to shift from defensive operations toward a bold offensive across the Central Pacific. This strategy was championed by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Ocean. Areas. The plan would become known as Operation Galvanic, the first major test of the island-hopping campaign aimed at cutting a direct path toward Japan's inner defensive ring, the target, the Gilbert Islands, a remote chain lying over 2,000 miles southwest of Hawaii. Of these, the most heavily defended was Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll. Though just a narrow strip of land roughly 2 miles long and no more than 800 yards wide, Betio held enormous strategic value. It housed a Japanese airfield and a network of coastal defenses that allowed Japan to extend patrols and air power across the Central Pacific. Capturing it would give the United States a forward airbase and a staging point for assaults deeper into Japanese-held territory, including the Marshall Islands for Japan. Betio had become a symbol of its Pacific barrier. Under the command of Rear Admiral K.G. Shibasaki, the island had been transformed into one of the most fortified positions in the Pacific. Shibasaki boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Betio in 100 years. The statement echoed through Japanese ranks, reinforcing the belief that well-prepared island defenses could halt any American attempt to break through. The Imperial Japanese Navy placed approximately 4,800 troops on the island, predominantly Special Naval Landing Force personnel. Supported by Korean laborers and conscripted workers, they constructed heavy fortifications, concrete bunkers, steel pillboxes, interlocking trenches, anti-aircraft guns, coastal artillery, and machine gun nests designed to cover every inch of the shoreline with lethal fire. Around and beyond the beaches, mines, wooden stakes, barbed wire, and coral obstacles were laid out to trap landing craft and expose infantry to point-blank attacks. American intelligence was aware of Tarawa's defenses but lacked precise detail. Aerial reconnaissance was limited, and pre-invasion assessments underestimated the complexity of the coral reef that surrounded Betio. Maps suggested that landing craft could clear the reef during high tide, a critical assumption that would soon prove dangerously flawed. In preparation for Operation Galvanic, the U.S. assembled a force of 35,000 troops, including the 2nd Marine Division under Major General Julian C. Smith. Warships, transports, carriers, and support vessels gathered at Pearl Harbor before moving west. For many Marines on board, this would be their first major amphibious assault against a fortified Japanese position. Training intensified in the months leading to the operation. Marines practiced beach landings, coordination with naval gunfire, and rapid movement off the sand under simulated enemy fire. Yet nothing fully replicated the reality awaiting them at Tarawa, an amphibious assault across a reef under direct fire against defenders who had sworn not to retreat. The U.S. Navy prepared one of the heaviest naval bombardments yet seen in the Pacific. Battleships, including the Maryland, Colorado, and Tennessee, along with cruisers and carriers, would soften the island ahead of the landing. The Americans believed that such firepower could neutralize or cripple the defenses long enough for infantry to establish a beachhead. Even so, some senior Marine officers warned that Tarawa would not fall easily. Experience in the Solomon Islands had taught them the ferocity of Japanese resistance, but no prior battle matched the level of fortification. the Marines would face at Betio. The operation would test not only courage, but the very doctrine the Marine Corps had spent decades developing. The stakes extended beyond immediate military gain. Failure would embolden Japan, delay the Central Pacific advance, and raise doubts in Washington and among allies about the viability of the island-hopping strategy. Success would prove that the United States could break through Japan's defensive ring, and that the Marines could seize even the strongest island fortress. As the invasion fleet steamed toward Tarawa in November 1943, tension mingled with grim determination. Many Marines expected a hard fight, but still believed naval and air bombardments would significantly reduce the defenders' ability to resist. They did not yet know that many Japanese bunkers were built to withstand direct hits, that communication trenches connected strong points across the island, or that Admiral Shibasaki's garrison had prepared to fight to the last man. The stage was set for a clash that would shock both nations. What followed on those sands would not only be a battle for territory, it would be a brutal test of will, resilience, and the reputation of the U.S. Marine Corps itself. In the decades before the Pacific War, the Japanese military fostered a deep belief in spiritual and moral superiority over Western forces. Rooted in the Bushido ethic and reinforced through strict military indoctrination, Japanese officers were taught that victory was achieved not merely through weapons or numbers, but through unwavering will and the readiness to die. This mindset influenced strategy, training, and battlefield expectations long before Tarawa. Japanese confidence surged after early war victories. The rapid collapse of Western defenses in 1941-42 in Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, and Hong Kong seemed to validate the idea that Western troops lacked resolve. Officers concluded that Americans, raised in comfort and unfamiliar with hardship, would break under the kind of pressure Japanese soldiers endured as a matter of duty and honor. Even after setbacks at Midway and Guadalcanal, the belief persisted. Japan had lost ships and aircraft, but not its warrior spirit. Against this backdrop, Tarawa became a test of ideology as much as strategy. Admiral Shibasaki and his officers believed that a fortified island, defended by men willing to die rather than surrender, could halt even a numerically superior force. Their doctrine emphasized static defense, entrenched positions, overlapping fire, and a pledge to fight to the last man. The expectation was not survival, but inflicting such horrific losses that the Americans would hesitate to continue their advance across the Pacific. This conviction shaped every bunker, trench, and firing position on Betio. It also fueled the dismissive attitude toward the U.S. Marines, a belief that no matter how many ships or aircraft America deployed, it could not match the spiritual strength and resolve of Japanese defenders. The coming battle would expose the limitations of this mindset, but at this stage, confidence overshadowed caution. While Japanese officers mocked American resolve, the U.S. Marine Corps had spent years preparing for precisely the kind of battle Tarawa represented. During the interwar period, Marine planners studied lessons from World War I, the Gallipoli campaign, and hypothetical island conflicts. They developed the world's first detailed doctrine for amphibious warfare, emphasizing coordination between naval firepower, landing craft, and infantry assault. The Marines trained rigorously in ship-to-shore operations, rehearsing beach landings, logistics, and rapid establishment of beachheads under simulated fire. Early exercises in the 1920s and 1930s revealed glaring weaknesses, prompting improvements in communication, equipment, and command structure. By the time war erupted, the Marine Corps had become the United States' spearhead for amphibious assaults. Combat experience in the Solomon Islands further hardened the Marines. At Guadalcanal, they endured relentless night attacks, disease, and supply shortages. They learned how the Japanese fought: tenacity, stealth, and willingness to counterattack regardless of casualties. These lessons refined Marine tactics, instilled caution, and strengthened resolve. By 1943, the Marines were no longer an overlooked branch. They had earned respect in Washington and among Allied commanders. Still, Tarawa represented a challenge unlike any they had faced. Unlike the jungles of Guadalcanal, Betio offered no cover, no room to maneuver, and no chance to retreat once the assault began. Marines would have to cross open sand under direct fire from fortified positions. Every mistake would cost lives. The training had prepared them for a difficult landing, Yet even the most experienced officers understood that Tarawa would test the limits of marine doctrine. The Corps would soon discover whether its years of planning and combat experience were enough to overcome an enemy certain of its superiority. Betio was not a typical island outpost. It was designed to be a fortress. Under Admiral Shibasaki's supervision, the Japanese constructed one of the most formidable defensive networks in the Pacific. Every inch of the island was planned for layered resistance. The goal was simple: ensure that any landing force would be shattered before it could establish a foothold. Betio's shoreline bristled with barbed wire, mines, wooden stakes, and steel obstacles intended to trap landing craft. Behind the beaches, concrete bunkers and pillboxes were positioned to deliver enfilading fire, sweeping the sand with machine guns and artillery. Many structures were reinforced to withstand naval bombardment, with walls several feet thick and firing slits designed for maximum protection and visibility. Japanese engineers integrated natural terrain into their defense. The surrounding coral reef created a natural barrier, preventing larger landing craft from reaching the shore at anything but high tide. Offshore guns and coastal artillery were calibrated for precise ranges, allowing defenders to target approaching vessels long before troops could disembark. Inside the island, trenches connected defensive positions, enabling rapid movement of troops and supplies without exposing them to fire. Mortars, anti-tank guns, and anti-aircraft weapons were strategically placed to counter both infantry and armored vehicles. The Japanese garrison was prepared to fight in compartments, falling back from one defensive line to the next, inflicting maximum casualties at each stage. The defensive plan assumed that even if Americans reached the island, the fight would devolve into brutal close-quarters combat, where Japanese training and determination would prevail. Shibasaki's confidence in these defenses contributed to his bold statement about Betio's impregnability. Yet no fortress is invulnerable. The Marines would soon test whether firepower, coordination, and sheer determination could break a defense built on certainty and sacrifice. Behind every map, strategy, and unit designation were individuals, young men on both sides preparing for a battle none of them would forget. For the Marines, the voyage toward Tarawa brought a mixture of anticipation and dread. Many were barely out of high school. Some had fought at Guadalcanal. Others were entering combat for the first time. They wrote letters home, cleaned their rifles repeatedly, and tried to steady their nerves as the fleet edged closer to the atoll. The Marines understood the stakes. Rumors circulated about the strength of Japanese fortifications and the resolve of their defenders. Officers did not hide the truth. Casualties were expected to be high. That knowledge weighed heavily on minds across the transports. Yet fear did not overpower duty. Training, camaraderie, and a deep sense of responsibility pushed men forward. Many reminded themselves that if they faltered here, the cost might be even greater on the next island, and every island after that. On Betio, Japanese defenders experienced their own emotional reckoning. Though confidence ran high among officers, the reality for enlisted men was complex. They knew reinforcement or evacuation was impossible. Supplies were limited. Once the battle began, survival was unlikely. Japanese military culture demanded readiness for self-sacrifice. Surrender was regarded as dishonor. Many soldiers wrote farewell notes to their families, fully aware they would not see Japan again. For both sides, the human cost would be immense. The coming battle would compress life, fear, courage, and death into a space barely large enough to walk across. Tarawa would become a crucible where ordinary men were tested under extraordinary conditions, in a place where the boundary between bravery and survival blurred amid fire and sand. Tarawa would expose the limits of technology and tactics in amphibious warfare. The U.S. military entered the operation believing it had the tools for success: specialized landing craft, naval bombardment, air support, and pioneering amphibious doctrine. Central to the assault were the Higgins boats and a newer vehicle, the LVT landing vehicle, tracked, known as Amtracs. Originally designed for rescue and logistics, Amtracs could crawl over reefs and obstacles, potentially allowing Marines to bypass natural barriers that stopped traditional landing craft. However, the plan carried assumptions that would prove critical. Intelligence suggested tides would be high enough for landing craft to clear the coral reef. If correct, troops could reach the beach quickly and in large numbers. If not, They would be forced to wade hundreds of yards through open water under direct fire, a scenario that planners understood would be devastating. Pre-invasion bombardment was another cornerstone of American tactics. Battleships and cruisers were expected to neutralize most Japanese strongpoints within hours. Air power would suppress remaining defensive positions. In theory, Marines would land against weakened resistance and push inland before the enemy could regroup. But Tarawa's defenses were engineered with bombardment in mind. Many Japanese bunkers were deep-set, reinforced with coconut logs and concrete designed to survive heavy shelling. Some artillery and machine gun positions were concealed or shielded to withstand direct hits. Even if bombardment inflicted damage, defenders could reoccupy firing positions through covered trenches. Tarawa would reveal a tactical truth that echoed across the Pacific. Success in amphibious warfare required not just firepower, but precise coordination, accurate intelligence, and adaptability under fire. The lessons learned on Betio would shape future operations: Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. But first, they would be written in blood. Before Tarawa, the American public had seen limited footage of Pacific combat. Reporting emphasized victories and progress, while the grim realities of jungle warfare remained distant. U.S. morale was rising, but there was a growing expectation of swift advances. Many Americans believed the war was turning decisively in their favor, unaware of the brutal cost that would accompany each step toward Japan. Military leaders understood that the Central Pacific Campaign required not only battlefield success but public endurance. If Operation Galvanic faltered, the psychological impact on the home front could be profound. Military correspondents, photographers, and cameramen accompanied the fleet, tasked with documenting the battle. What they would capture at Tarawa would shock the nation and challenge the public's perception of victory. In Japan, propaganda portrayed the coming battle with confidence. Newspapers and radio broadcasts reinforced the idea that Japanese soldiers, guided by superior spirit, would crush any American landing. The capture of an airfield at the edge of Japan's defensive ring would be celebrated as evidence of Japan's ability to hold its empire. Defeat was not a scenario propaganda considered or allowed. The contrasting media narratives reflected the broader war of morale. For the U.S., showing the truth could rally determination, but too much truth risked undermining support. For Japan, concealing vulnerability was essential to preserving national resolve. As Tarawa approached, neither nation fully grasped how the images and stories emerging from the island would become turning points, influencing public perception, military policy, and the legacy of the Marine Corps for generations. Dawn on 20th November 1943 marked the beginning of one of the most brutal 76 hours in Marine Corps history. As the invasion fleet formed its assault waves offshore, naval guns thundered in a final barrage. Battleships and cruisers pounded Betio, sending plumes of sand, smoke, and shattered timber into the air. Aircraft swooped low, dropping bombs that rippled across the island's narrow spine. From a distance, it appeared as though no living defender could have survived. Many Marines watching from their transports believed the bombardment had done its job. The shoreline looked scorched and silent. Yet beneath the smoke, inside reinforced bunkers and trenches, Japanese defenders braced themselves, shaken, but far from broken. At 09 Armar, the first assault waves began moving toward the island. Amtraks churned forward, carrying Marines of the 2nd Marine Division toward Red Beach 1, 2, and 3. Behind them followed Higgins boats, each loaded with men prepared to step into the unknown. The plan depended on the tide. High water was needed for landing craft to clear the coral reef. But the tide ran lower than predicted. As the Amtraks pushed ahead, many Higgins boats struck the reef and ground to a halt. Suddenly, the battlefield shifted. Marines aboard the stranded craft realized they faced a deadly choice: stay aboard and become stationary targets, or climb over the gunwales and wade several hundred yards through chest-deep water toward the beach, exposed to direct fire. Men began to disembark, rifles held high, moving slowly across the lagoon as machine guns opened up from concealed positions along the seawall. The Japanese had waited. As Marines advanced, the defenders unleashed a storm of fire. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery tore into the assault waves. Bullets snapped across the water. Shells exploded with lethal precision. Many Marines fell before reaching the island. Others vanished beneath the surf. Officers tried to maintain order, urging their men forward. But the ocean itself became a battleground, a killing ground dotted with bodies, equipment, and shattered landing craft. Those in the Amtraks fared better initially, able to push over the reef and onto the sand. But once on the beach, they drew concentrated fire. Some Amtraks burst into flames. Crews bailed out, scrambling for any cover they could find. The narrow shoreline offered little refuge, only a sand embankment and scattered debris from the bombardment. By mid-morning, chaos gripped the beaches. Units were fragmented, command structures frayed. Radio men struggled to maintain communication under fire. In some sectors, only a handful of Marines made it ashore. Yet amid the disorder, pockets of resolve took hold. Small groups of Marines pressed forward, crawling, sprinting, and throwing themselves against the seawall to survive the withering fire. The Japanese defense was coordinated with devastating efficiency. Pre-sighted machine guns swept the approaches. Mortars targeted clusters of Marines trying to reorganize. From well-protected bunkers, gunners poured fire into the landing zones. Each minute felt longer than the last, and casualties mounted rapidly. Still, the assault did not collapse. Leadership at the platoon and company level proved decisive. Officers and non-commissioned officers rose to the moment. When Marines became isolated, they linked up with others nearby, regardless of unit. Improvised teams formed, some no larger than 5 or 6 men, determined to push inland. By noon, elements of the 2nd Battalion, 2nd Marines, and 3rd Battalion, 2nd Marines had carved out a tenuous foothold on Red Beach 2. They climbed over the seawall and engaged Japanese positions at close range, using grenades, demolition charges, and flamethrowers to silence firing points. Progress was measured in yards, every bunker taken costing lives. On Red Beach 1, the situation was worse. Resistance was fierce, and the lagoon crossing had been deadly. But a small number of Marines reached the seawall and held on, refusing to be driven back. Offshore, commanders realized reinforcements had to be committed despite the danger. Waves of Marines continued to attempt the crossing, each suffering heavy casualties. Throughout the afternoon, the battle intensified. Naval gunfire and air support were called in to suppress strongpoints, but proximity to American troops limited their use. The fight became intimate, bunker to bunker, trench to trench. Marines used satchel charges to crack open pillboxes, and flamethrowers to clear defenders who refused to retreat. Amid the carnage, acts of courage stood out. Marines exposed themselves to enemy fire to pull wounded comrades to safety. Others charged fortified positions to silence guns that were cutting down men on the beach. Such moments of resolve prevented the assault from stalling completely. As daylight began to fade, a narrow line of Marines held a precarious strip of Betio. The cost had already been staggering, yet withdrawal was never an option. They dug in, bracing for counterattacks that could come at any moment. Behind them in the lagoon, the water still carried the remnants of the morning assault, a stark reminder of the price paid just to reach the sand. Night on Betio approached, and with it, the threat of Japanese infiltration and close-quarters combat. But the Marines had done what many believed impossible only hours before. They were ashore, and they would not be pushed back. The first day had tested every assumption, every tactic, and every belief held on both sides. The battle for Betio was far from decided. The fiercest fighting still lay ahead. The Battle of Tarawa did not fade quietly into military archives. Its shockwaves echoed across oceans, war rooms, and living rooms, reshaping strategy, public perception, and the psychological understanding of what lay ahead in the Pacific. News of the casualties, over 1,000 Marines killed in just 76 hours, landed heavily in American households. For the first time, U.S. censors allowed graphic combat footage and photographs to be released to the public. When the documentary With the Marines at Tarawa was screened in early 1944, many viewers wept. Others fainted. Critics argued that the scenes were too brutal to show, yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt insisted the American people had a right to see the cost of the war their sons were fighting. Tarawa had lifted the curtain. The public response was complex. Shock, grief, anger, and a grim resolve. Instead of weakening morale, it steeled it. Americans now understood that the road to Tokyo would not be lined with quick victories or mild resistance. If such a tiny island demanded such a price, what would Saipan, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, or Okinawa cost. Military leadership absorbed Tarawa's lessons with urgency. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps immediately began redesigning amphibious doctrine. New amphibious tractors, LVT-4s, were ordered in greater numbers, this time with rear ramps for faster unloading. Engineers refined pre-landing bombardment tactics, increasing the duration and caliber of naval gunfire for future invasions. Perhaps the most important adaptation was in intelligence and reconnaissance. Prior to Tarawa, tidal predictions and coral reef mapping were minimal. After Tarawa, hydrographic surveys, underwater reconnaissance teams, and tide analysis became essential. Within months, the Navy introduced specialized underwater demolition teams, the precursors of the U.S. Navy SEALs, tasked with clearing beach obstacles and gathering water-depth intelligence. In Japan, however, the reaction was deeply different. Tarawa stunned the Imperial General Staff. Japanese officers reviewed Shibasaki's failure and saw both warning and opportunity. They admired the ferocity of the American Marines, no longer dismissing them as inexperienced. The Japanese High Command began strengthening island defenses deeper inland, adopting a defense-in-depth strategy rather than trying to defeat invasions at the beaches alone. This shift would later make battles like Peleliu and Iwo Jima even more costly. But there was another change, quieter, psychological, and profound. Until Tarawa, many Japanese commanders believed that Americans lacked the spirit for close-quarter, brutal combat. That myth died on Betio's shores. Officers began instructing troops that the Americans would fight to the last man, and Japanese propaganda shifted. The enemy was no longer soft. They were relentless. For the Marines, Tarawa became an uncompromising benchmark of courage and sacrifice. The island's thin strip of sand entered Marine Corps history with a weight equal to Antietam, the Somme, or Verdun in the minds of soldiers. Years later, veterans rarely spoke of Tarawa. The memories were too sharp, too vivid, too costly in human terms. Survivors recalled the heat, the smell, the silence after the battle far more than the gunfire. For them, Tarawa was not a triumph. It was a graveyard. Yet history would remember it differently. Tarawa became the battle that proved America could storm the Pacific. It validated the doctrine of amphibious assault. It delivered the first clear message to Japan that the United States would not stop until the war was won, and for those who set foot on Betio, whether they lived to return home or not, Tarawa marked a personal turning point. War was no longer distant, strategic, or theoretical. It was real, intimate, chaotic, and devastating. The island remained scarred long after the war ended. Remains of Marines and Japanese defenders lay buried in the sand for decades, slowly recovered over time. Each recovered dog tag, each set of bones, each rusted helmet served as a reminder of the price paid in 1943. Tarawa's legacy was not held in speeches or strategy manuals alone. It lived in the silence of veterans' eyes, in the lessons written into military doctrine, and in the way nations understood the brutal arithmetic of island warfare. What happened at Tarawa forced both sides to confront an uncomfortable truth. The Pacific War would only grow more violent from here, and it is from this realization, this shift in the moral and human understanding of the conflict, that the final reflection emerges. The Battle of Tarawa endures as one of the most defining crucibles of the Pacific. War, not because of its scale, but because of what it revealed about modern conflict, national resolve, and the human spirit under fire. On a map, Betio was little more than a speck in the ocean, a strip of sand barely large enough for an airstrip, remote and seemingly insignificant. Yet in November 1943, it became the stage on which two empires tested their doctrine, their courage, and their belief in victory. Tarawa stripped war of illusions. It demonstrated that technological superiority alone could not guarantee a swift or bloodless victory. The Marines had battleships, carriers, aircraft, amphibious tractors, and overwhelming firepower, yet none of it spared them from the coral reef, the murderous fields of fortified guns, or the hand-to-hand combat that raged behind the beaches. It proved that war, even in the age of machines, remained brutally human. For Japan, Tarawa shattered the myth of American softness. For the United States, it shattered the belief that the Pacific Campaign would mirror the rapid advances seen in the Central Solomons. The price paid on Betio forced a recalibration of strategy, expectations, and values on both sides. But beyond the tactics and the outcome, Tarawa left a deeper legacy, one carved into memory, not just into history. It became a solemn reminder of the cost of progress in war. Hundreds of young men fell within sight of the sea, many before their boots touched the beach. They had crossed half the world not for conquest, but to push back the tide of militarism that had swept across the Pacific. Their sacrifice was not measured only in territory gained or airfields captured, but in the resolve it instilled. From Tarawa onward, the United States understood that victory would not come cheaply. The path to Japan would demand endurance, adaptation, and an unwavering acceptance of hardship. Today, Tarawa stands as a symbol of transformation. It marks the moment when the Pacific War shifted from uncertain advance to determined inevitability. And it serves as a quiet testament to those who, in the span of 76 hours, changed the course of a war on a distant shore. Their story reminds us that history is often decided not by the size of the battlefield, but by the magnitude of the sacrifice made upon it. Subscribe for more true stories that remind us of what it means to be human, even in the darkest of times.